Hello, this is Dr. Dave Maslach talking about reciprocity.com, the sharing economy proofreading platform that I'm trying to build. The E is spelled with a 3. And in this particular video, I really wanted to talk about startups and risk and uncertainty within the experimental economy. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to get into talking about what exactly is this thing that I'm calling the experimental economy. I mean, it's a strange thing, right? And then get into what are some of the risks and problems with dealing with the experimental economy. And then finally, perhaps suggest a couple of, maybe a couple of recommendations on how to deal with some of these risks and uncertainties with the experimental economy. All right, so what is the experimental economy? What is this thing? That is the suggestion that we are becoming more and more open to experimenting both on ourselves and on consumers, right? So if you look at businesses, for example, software companies now, it is extremely common for software companies to, for online marketing folks to do A/B testing, right? So this is where you have a control condition, a treatment condition, and then in the treatment is you're giving some sort of change to that treatment condition, and you randomize it across multiple groups. And then you see what the outcome is. You want to see if the treatment actually did something relative to the control, and you want to see what happens. So maybe it might be the wording. Maybe you tell a more richer story in the treatment condition. Maybe you do things like changing the color. Maybe you change the sort of font size or the button. You make a bigger button, that kind of thing on your web page. Now, this is fantastic for a number of different reasons. I'll get into those in a minute. But I also want to give you another suggestion, another example, what I mean by the experimental economy. I think it's becoming much more accepted for people to experiment, for individuals to experiment with supplements and drugs. Different things like, all within the sort of fitness and healthcare craze, all these kind of drugs and supplements that are available that people are willing to try and experiment with before they're tested and well vetted and they've gone through sort of pharmaceutical clinical trials and all that kind of stuff. The way that we get around that, the way that sort of that industry, the healthcare and fitness industry gets around doing clinical trials is they label it a supplement or a nutrition aid or something along those lines, that they don't have to go through clinical trials as if you label it a pharmaceutical. And that's a really important thing because there's a tremendous amount of money spent on clinical testing in pharmaceuticals. So that's why those companies often go around it and they try something else. The other thing that's really kind of interesting is there is a push to go out and just try things now. And this is part of, maybe it's the entrepreneurial economy, part of the sort of innovation economy. We're really, really pushed to get out and to try things, to experiment, to just kind of play around with the world, right? And what do I mean by experimentation? That is the sort of scenario, or that is the technique of coming up with some sort of hypothesis, right? And testing those hypotheses in the world in some sort of controlled fashion, and then using, trying to replicate those findings that you think either confirm your beliefs. But that's not really what we're taught in science. That's why I'm sort of hesitating. I'm not trying to frustrate things a little bit. But what we're trained to do is we're trying to actually, when we experiment, we want to falsify. We want to make sure that we rule out the hypothesis, right? So we think that the world thinks like this. And what we're trying to do is rule out that sort of way of thinking, right? So and then what ends up happening, and there's rationale behind it, sort of logic behind it. But if you have something that is confirmed, a hypothesis that is confirmed, what we like to say is that it's not disconfirmed. It's a double negative. And the reason is that it's really hard to confirm a hypothesis. You can't necessarily say that something is true. The only thing that you can do in this world is say that we couldn't rule that possibility out. And that's what we're trying to do. And you build this sort of hypothesis, right? So with the software example, we do these A/B testing. So we find one version that works really well, that iteration that works really well. And then from there, we keep building on that. We think that it works. It leads to an extra couple of sales, for example. And then we build on that. And we continuously keep building and iterating on that, right? So that mindset, it's a really cool and interesting thing because it allows you to try different things. It pushes you to go into different dimensions. It allows you to explore the environment that you have. There's all sorts of benefits from that, meaning that there might be what is called better maximums, or what you're stuck in a local minimum. So you're stuck in a situation where it's not necessarily the best situation, but it's okay. And unless you don't try those different scenarios, you're not going to know whether something is actually better out there, right? But here's the thing. Experimentation includes a lot of trials and errors. There's a lot of problems that happens along the way. We typically only think and we typically only praise the trials as sort of successful things that happened. But there is so much to consider in experimentation and the problems of experimentation when we're doing something like this. This is the reason, and I'm going to come back to this again, pharmaceutical companies spend billions of dollars on developing a drug, and a large part of it is through clinical trials, going from that little tiny test and seeing if it actually works and going to something that's bigger and bigger and bigger, where you're actually giving to more and more people, making sure all the time. And there's so much rigor that's put into it. It's extremely hard to do. There's so much rigor at each one of those steps to show that there is an effect and it's not going to harm somebody. That's a really difficult thing to do. And that's why we spend so much money on pharmaceuticals to make sure that they're safe, as well as there's an effect on the drugs that are being produced, that it's going to be effective, right? That's what we're really trying to do. And that I do have a bias towards pharmaceuticals because of this rigorous testing that's involved. And yes, there's incentives in the pharmaceutical industry to do sort of crazy things and to sort of maximize profits and stuff like that, which sometimes leads pharmaceutical companies to stray. But in general, they're maximizing the unmet needs, or they're solving the unmet needs as much as possible, using sort of maximizing profits. And the only way that you can actually get there in the current environment is to do this clinical testing that costs billions and billions of dollars. So they're investing the profits. The other thing that ends up happening is that those profits and the motive for profits allows people to be motivated to continue to work on those really difficult things and spending a tremendous amount of money on clinical trials, because they know that eventually it's going to make them substantial amounts of money, right? So that's the benefits. Anyways, I digress. So what I am suggesting with the experimentation economy, well, I think it's great because it allows you to explore and find maximums out there that you wouldn't normally have found. There's so many problems and so many difficulties that we ignore along the way, right? So the first one I'm going to point out, and the reason why I am talking about this is I was recently going through sort of ethics and IRB approval for something that I'm doing. I'm a professor of innovation, strategy, and entrepreneurship, and I was going through the process of getting what's called IRB, Institutional Review Board, approval at every single university in the US and across the world, right? They have their own sort of different ways. In Canada, it was called ethics approval. I think in Britain it's probably somewhat similar, and I believe so. Anyways, in each university they have a board that sits down, and you apply to that board to suggest that the experiment that you're doing, or that you're thinking of doing, the research that you're thinking of doing, it's not just experiment, but research in general, is not going to harm people, or if it does harm people, that the sort of benefits to them, to those specific people that are involved in the research, are going to outweigh the costs. And it's really important to do this. There's so many examples, going back to, when we were starting to be really aware of this, right? So you want to think about sort of the Nazi experiments, right? So this is all the nasty stuff that Mendel, I believe his name was. I might be getting that wrong. But anyways, he was doing some really nasty things on the Jewish population in concentration camps, which is awful, right? We don't want that to happen. That was kind of the first moment where we're like, whew, we can really do some bad things. This is awful as scientists and researchers to do this kind of stuff. And then there was, many different cases along the way, sort of doing fake shock tests along the way where people were traumatized from the fake shocks, as well as the Stanford prison experiments where people were pretended to be locked up as prisoners. College kids were locked up as prisoners in... and this was Philip Zimbardo's and Christina Maslach's work. Hey, great last name, right? So they locked people up, in these college kids, at the basement of a university, Stanford University, and then they wanted to see what was going to happen, the social dynamics between people that were sort of controlling the others. And pretty soon it got really out of control. In fact, it was very quickly. It was within a matter of days that it got out of control, and they had to stop that because of sort of the unintended consequences that they never expected. It was just so horrendous, the things that were happening and the trauma that these kids were experiencing. And then, there's things of being, experiments on trials, clinical trials on sort of risk groups that are out there, right? So underprivileged kids, for example, or kids that were in, that there were orphans or people that were prisoners. And that was until I want to say the late 70s, early 80s, that they were doing things on prisoners because they were an easy population to get to, right? There was all this sort of stuff that we thought was socially acceptable and okay to do. But it wasn't until we started looking into it that we're like, whew, we really can't do that. There's all these ethical considerations that you should consider when you do experiments. And this is really easy to get to the point where you are doing stuff that's unethical or that's going to harm people. It's extremely easy to get to that situation. You might think it's harmless, but you didn't think about that unrepresented group, right? So, for example, you might be doing A/B experiments on software or platform, but then you're targeting certain unrepresented groups or certain groups that are that for whatever reason they're responding all the more to this sort of ad, and pretty soon you're blatantly targeting a certain set of individuals that you wouldn't necessarily think was socially acceptable to do, and you're targeting them in kind of maybe not so the best way, right? So using sort of stereotypes and things like that. That's really, really important to think about when you're doing this. And it's important to think about the risk of experimentation when you're doing this. It's not just innocuous. It's really difficult to think about these kind of things along the way. The other thing that's really important when you're doing experiments, this is the second thing I want to point out, it's extremely costly, right? That's why the pharmaceutical industry spends billions of dollars. It's not everything works out. In fact, most things don't work out. You're expecting, just have in your mindset that you're going to spend 80% more than you thought you're going to spend, and then you're going to get only 20% of what you thought you were going to get from it, right? So it's really costly. Maybe it is slightly more effective than kind of just grabbing around in the dark, but at the same time, know that it's very, very costly along the way. The other thing that's really important to think about, this is the third thing, is that you have to think about, is this based on some sort of theoretical principles? Is this based on sort of mere replication of what's already existed in the past? Or is there sort of foundational knowledge and understanding why that's happening? That's important to think about, because you can get into situations what's called superstitious learning, where you don't understand the cause and effect of how they work, and you can be steered in a really weird direction, and you can get really weird things happening. And I encourage you to look at the B.F. Skinner's work where he talked about this. He's just foundational father of psychology, where we just start doing really random and weird things because we don't understand the cause and effect behind why something happens. So you have to be really careful that you're not just simply replicating the best practices that are out there and you're really giving it some thought. And then the other thing above that is you want to make sure that the experiments that you're doing are general enough that they can be generalized around to apply across your firm, across whatever you're looking at. It has to be pretty generalizable because you can leverage those results all the more. So I think what I'm trying to get at is that there is tremendous amount of benefits to the experimental economy, but we often neglect all of the problems that are with the experimental economy. And to me, what I would suggest that you do as an experimentalist, right? If you're doing A/B testing or you're experimenting with your own self, is I would encourage you to go onto a university's IRB board or IRB documents and go through and look at that stuff and see all the issues that they dealt with along the way. I mean, we spend hours and hours and hours. We spend a tremendous amount of resources making sure that the things that we do are ethically sound, that they're rigorous and all that kind of stuff. I encourage you to really look at that before you go out and start doing experimental work, and just understand that there are risks and benefits to many different groups available and that you're really considering the ethics behind it. And as you grow your organization, as you grow and get bigger as an organization, I encourage you to start setting off having a separate committee that's independent as much as you can to evaluate whether something that you're doing with this sort of experimental mindset is ethically and morally okay, right? So often Google does something similar to this. They go on and they say, is this evil, right? Having those questions, having a set of questions, maybe that's what you should do, is have a list of 5 different questions of how you're evaluating the experiment or the thing that you're doing, the trial that you're doing, to make sure that you're not doing anything that is, taking you in the wrong direction. And you have to really consider that you're not going in that wrong direction. You're making sure that you're very much evaluating the experimental conditions that you're doing, the sort of danger that you're doing, right? That is extremely important, and you really want to understand, just having an external look, whether it's in your organization, somebody that is going to evaluate those different experiments before you go on and sort of run them at a mass scale. It's important to think about that as much as you possibly can. Do things at a really small scale. Imagine that you are a pharmaceutical company, and the way they do things, they do bench tests, and then they might pilot on maybe 100 people, and then they pilot it on a couple of thousand people. It gets bigger and bigger until eventually it's distributed widely. And that's what you have to think about. It's just starting off really small and seeing what the results are and continuing to grow that way. I really encourage you to do that. The reason why I'm thinking about this is I've been really thinking about the issues that I'm dealing with reciprocity, right? So part of my goal is to eventually allow other researchers to do experimental stuff on here with A/B testings, but I want to make sure that it's very ethically sound, right? So the one thing the thing that, obviously I would like to vet everything that goes in there, or have a committee or something like that to vet all the experiments that go in there. But at the same time, I also I want to make sure that there is IRB approval for everything that is done at the institution that is doing the experiments. It's incredibly important to think about, because I want to make sure it's sound and rigorous and it's not going to harm people, right? That is key for why I'm doing reciprocity. So if you like this video, make sure you do the old thumbs up. Hopefully you appreciate it. You can also do the and then that's great feedback, because then I understand what's going on. And make sure, if you like the Reciprocity Project, go to the website and check it out. It's the E is spelled with a 3. What I'm trying to do is set up sort of a thing that's going to help out editors, proofreaders, and writers, and really sort of try to benefit graduate students as much as possible. It was set up for my own problem, to solve my own problem that I couldn't find, different... I got an itchy lip. I couldn't find I couldn't find great editors and stuff like that, and great proofreaders. So I wanted to create a system that was generalizable. Anybody can go on there and put it out there. And then if there's any profits or any, profits that's generated, eventually I want to start giving back to as much as I can to, graduate students and fellow writers, people that are doing interesting things with scholarships and stuff like that. I really do like that idea. I'm really enamored with it, and that is my end goal. Maybe it's going to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but that is my goal with this. So thank you so much. Take care, and I am really looking forward to seeing you on the next video. Bye.